If you look at a map of reported Sasquatch sightings in North America, you will see a scattering of red dots across the continent. There are clusters in Florida, pockets in the Appalachians, and lines following the Rocky Mountains. But if you look at the Pacific Northwest, specifically the state of Washington, the map does not show dots. It shows a solid, bleeding wound of red. Washington state is the epicenter. It is the Vatican City of the Bigfoot phenomenon. According to the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization, the BFRO, Washington has over 700 certified investigated sightings. But statistical analysts estimate that for every sighting reported, 10 go unreported due to fear of ridicule. That puts the number in the thousands. To understand why Washington is the capital, we must stop looking at the creature and start looking at the land. We need to understand the biomass equation. A biological organism is fundamentally an engine. It burns fuel. The larger the engine, the more fuel it requires. A creature standing 8 feet tall and weighing 800 pounds would require a caloric intake that is staggering, likely between 5,000 and 10,000 calories a day, depending on activity levels. You cannot support a population of giant primates in a desert. You cannot support them in a tundra. You need a grocery store that never closes. Washington is that grocery store. The geography of Washington, particularly the Olympic Peninsula and the western slopes of the Cascade Range, creates a temperate rainforest ecosystem that is unique on the planet. This is the green Inferno. It receives over 140 inches of rain a year. This massive hydration creates a biomass density, the sheer weight of living matter per square acre, that rivals the Amazon jungle. Everything here grows bigger. The ferns grow to the height of a man. The cedar trees grow to the size of skyscrapers, and the food sources are endless. We are talking about a year-round buffet of huckleberries, salmonberries, salal, skunk cabbage roots, and fiddlehead ferns. And then there is the protein. Washington hosts massive herds of Roosevelt elk, the largest subspecies of elk in North America. It has black-tailed deer, and crucially, it has the salmon runs. 5 species of Pacific salmon choke the rivers every year, delivering millions of pounds of fat and protein directly into the forest. A primate species living here would not starve, it would thrive. This ecological perfection explains the possibility of the creature, but the geography explains the secrecy. Skeptics often ask, if there are so many of them in Washington, why don't we see them every day? The answer lies in the topography. The Cascade Mountains are not gentle hills. They are violent, volcanic scars. The terrain is incredibly steep, filled with ravines and box canyons that are inaccessible to vehicles and treacherous for hikers. There are millions of acres in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest and the Olympic National Park where no human foot has stepped in 50 years. It is a 3-dimensional labyrinth. A creature can be 200 yards away from a logging road, but if it is down in a ravine filled with devil's club and old-growth timber, it is effectively on another planet. But the history of Washington's Bigfoot is not just about geography. It is about a legacy that predates the United States. Before the borders were drawn, this land belonged to the Coast, Salish, the Chinook, the Lummi, and the Yakama nations. And they did not have myths about Bigfoot. They had names for him. The word Sasquatch itself is an anglicization of the Salish word skets, which loosely translates to wild man of the woods. To the indigenous people of Washington, Saskets was not a monster. He was another tribe. He was a neighbor. The Chehalis people tell stories of the basket woman, or the giant who would snatch salmon from the nets. The folklore is specific. It describes the creature's whistling sound reported by modern loggers to this day. It describes their social structure. It describes them digging for clams on the beaches of the Hood Canal at low tide. When the white settlers arrived in the late 1800s, they brought their skepticism, but the mountains quickly humbled them. The early newspapers of Washington from Bellingham to Vancouver are filled with reports from prospectors and timber cruisers, who came running back to town, pale and shaking, claiming to have been stoned by mountain devils. One of the most defining characteristics of the Washington sightings is the aggressive nature of the encounters. Unlike the shy, fleeting glimpses reported in other parts of the country, the Washington Sasquatch seems to hold its ground. we have to look at the psychological impact of the dark woods. In Washington, the canopy is so thick that in many places, sunlight never touches the forest floor. It creates a perpetual twilight. This environment affects the human psyche. It causes a hyperawareness, a primal anxiety. When people enter these woods, they feel like intruders. And the phenomenon reinforces this feeling. There is a specific area in Washington, south of Mount St. Helens, that has become legendary for this hostility. It is known as Ape Canyon. It was here, in 1924, that a group of miners claimed to have been under siege. This was not a sighting, it was a battle. But before we descend into the violence of Ape Canyon, we must establish the scientific credibility of this region. Washington was the home of Dr. Grover Krantz, a professor of physical anthropology at Washington State University. He was the first serious academic to risk his career on the subject. Krantz didn't look at folklore, he looked at anatomy. He studied the footprints found in the Blue Mountains of Washington. He analyzed the dermal ridges, the fingerprints on the feet and the flexible mid-tarsal break, a skeletal feature that a human foot does not possess, but a bipedal ape would need to navigate the steep slopes of the Cascades. Krantz argued that the Washington landscape was the only place in North America capable of hiding a breeding population of Gigantopithecus, black ear, massive, extinct ape from Asia that likely migrated across the land bridge. He argued that Washington is a biological refuge. So, we have the calories to feed them. We have the terrain to hide them. We have the indigenous history to name them. And we have the scientific theory to explain them. Washington isn't just a place where people see things. It is a habitat. As we move deeper into this investigation, we will look at the specific behaviors that make the Washington Sasquatch unique. We will examine the aggressive stone throwing, the terrifying vocalizations recorded in the Snohomish River Valley, and the physical evidence that was left behind in the mud of the Skookum Meadows. But first, we must go back to 1924, to a small cabin built on the side of a volcano, to a night where 5 miners learned that in the state of Washington, you are not the top of the food chain. To understand the ferocity of the Washington state phenomenon, we must travel back to 1924. We go to a gorge on the southeast flank of Mount St. Helens. Today, this area is scarred by volcanic ash, but back then, it was a pristine, dense wilderness. A group of 5 gold prospectors, led by a man named Fred Beck, had staked a claim. They built a sturdy log cabin. They were hard men, miners accustomed to the solitude and the dangers of the wild. They were not prone to ghost stories. But what happened to them on a warm July night became the most terrifying encounter in cryptozoological history. It is known as the Siege of Ape Canyon. The conflict began during the day. Fred Beck and another miner were working their claim when they saw a figure watching them from a ridge. It was roughly 7 feet tall, covered in dark hair, and distinctly humanoid. In a panic, or perhaps seeing it as a threat to their gold, Beck raised his rifle and fired. The creature recoiled, seemingly hit, and fell over the ridge into the canyon below. The miners checked, but the body was gone. They returned to their cabin, unsettled. As night fell, the atmosphere in the gorge changed. The silence was heavy. The miners went to sleep, guns loaded by their beds. Around midnight, they were awakened by a tremendous thud against the wall of the cabin. Then, another on the roof. It sounded like heavy rocks were being hurled with immense force. The cabin, built of heavy pine logs, began to shake. This was not a bear. Bears do not throw rocks. Bears do not coordinate attacks. And the miners soon realized they were not dealing with one creature. They were dealing with a troop. The siege lasted until dawn. The miners reported hearing heavy bipedal footsteps stomping on the roof. They heard vocalizations, screams and grunts echoing from the darkness. At one point, a section of the chinking the mud and moss between the logs was pushed in. A massive, hairy hand reached into the cabin, groping for a weapon or a man. Fred Beck fired his rifle into the ceiling and at the walls, trying to drive them back. The creatures did not break down the door, but they terrorized the men for hours. It was a display of dominance. It was a retaliation for the shooting earlier that day. When the sun finally rose, the noise stopped. The miners cautiously opened the door. The ground around the cabin was covered in massive rocks and footprints. They did not stay to pack their equipment. They did not stay to guard their gold. They ran. They hiked miles out of the wilderness, leaving everything behind, and swore never to return. Fred Beck told his story to the press, and despite ridicule, he maintained until his death, "I fought the ape-men of Mount St. Helens." This event cemented the reputation of the Washington Bigfoot as a territorial and vengeful entity. But the connection between the creatures and the volcano did not end in 1924. It climaxed on May 18, 1980. At 8:32 a.m., Mount St. Helens erupted. It was the most destructive volcanic event in United States history. The entire north face of the mountain slid away, triggering a lateral blast that flattened 230 square miles of forest in seconds. The energy released was equivalent to 24 megatons of thermal energy. If the area around Mount St. Helens was indeed the habitat of a breeding population of Sasquatches, the Ape Canyon, incident and centuries of indigenous lore suggested then the eruption was not just a geological event, it was a biological catastrophe. This brings us to one of the darkest conspiracy theories in the state of Washington, the body retrieval operation. In the days immediately following the eruption, the National Guard and federal agencies established a red zone. It was a total exclusion zone. No civilians, no press, no unauthorized personnel were allowed in. Ostensibly, this was for safety. The ash was hot, the mud flows were unstable. But whispers began to emerge from the soldiers and helicopter pilots who flew the recovery missions. There are persistent reports off the record, whispered in bars in Yakima and Castle Rock, that the government didn't just find human bodies. They found other bodies. Pilots reported seeing massive hair-covered carcasses partially buried in the ash flows. Some were burned, some were blown apart by the concussive force. The official explanation for these carcasses was singed bears. But bears do not have five-fingered hands. Bears do not have flat, human-like faces. One recurring story involves a pile of bodies found near the Tuttle River. A National Guard crew was allegedly ordered to load these bears into a cargo net. When they got close, they realized the anatomy was wrong. They were told by their commanding officers to ask no questions, load the cargo, and forget what they saw. The bodies were reportedly flown to a secure location, some say McCord Air Force Base, and never seen again. Why would the government cover this up? The logic goes back to panic and economics. The eruption was already a national crisis. Revealing the existence of a biological monster in the middle of a disaster zone would have caused mass hysteria. Furthermore, admitting that the eruption had wiped out a significant portion of an undocumented hominid species would have turned the site from a geological curiosity into a biological graveyard, halting the cleanup and the logging industry's recovery efforts. Whether or not the government collected bodies, the eruption had an undeniable effect on the phenomenon. In the years following 1980, sightings in the surrounding areas skyrocketed. Creatures that had lived in the deep, isolated valleys of St. Helens were forced to migrate. Their habitat was ash. Their food sources were incinerated. They moved north into the Gifford Pinchot Forest. They moved west toward the coast. The eruption didn't kill the legend, it displaced it. It pushed the creatures closer to the roads, closer to the towns, and closer to us. The legend of Ape Canyon and the eruption of Mount St. Helens provide a historical bookend to the mystery. They show us that these creatures are not invincible spirits. They are flesh and blood. They can be shot, they can be burned, and they can die. And if they can die, they can be found. Stories are easy to dismiss. A miner can be hallucinating from gas fumes. A soldier can be confused by the chaos of a volcanic eruption. Eyewitness testimony, in a court of law and in science, is the lowest form of evidence. To prove the existence of a biological species, you need biology. You need physical traces that can be measured, cast, and analyzed under a microscope. And it is here, in the mud of Washington state, that the Sasquatch has left its most controversial mark. The geography of Washington provides a unique forensic advantage. It is wet. The constant rain and the deep clay-rich soil create a perfect medium for preserving impressions. In the 1980s, this geology collided with a man named Paul Freeman. Freeman is a polarizing figure in the Bigfoot community, a former butcher living in Walla Walla, Washington. He patrolled the Blue Mountains range in the southeast corner of the state. Critics called him a hoaxer because he found too much evidence. But when forensic experts looked at the casts he poured from the tracks he found, the laughter stopped. These weren't just foot-shaped holes in the ground. The soil in the Blue Mountains is fine-grained loess. It captured detail down to the millimeter. Freeman's casts showed something that wooden stompers cannot fake. Dermatoglyphics. Dermatoglyphics are dermal ridges fingerprints, but on the foot, every primate has them. They provide traction. In the late 1990s, a man named Jimmy Chilcott decided to examine Freeman's evidence. Chilcott was not a Bigfoot hunter. He was a latent fingerprint examiner for the Conroe, Texas Police Department. He was an expert in friction ridge analysis, having studied the prints of gorillas and macaques to differentiate them from humans at crime scenes. When Chilcott placed the Washington casts under magnification, he found ridge flow patterns that defied explanation. Human ridge flow runs transversely across the foot. The ridges on the Freeman casts ran vertically up and down the foot. Furthermore, the ridges were twice the thickness of a human's. But the most convincing detail was the scarring. The casts showed healed scars and imperfections in the skin texture that were perfectly biologically consistent with a heavy animal walking barefoot over rocks for decades. To fake this, a hoaxer would need to etch microscopic lines into a fake foot with a level of anatomical knowledge that rivals a university professor. Chilcott concluded. This is an unknown primate, but footprints are just the extremities. The most significant piece of physical evidence in the history of the phenomenon was discovered in September of 2000. This is the Skookum cast. The location was the Skookum Meadows in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, the same dark, volcanic wilderness that surrounds Mount St. Helens. The Bigfoot field researchers, organization BFRO, had organized a massive expedition. They were not just walking trails, they were setting traps. They created a bait station in the middle of a muddy logging road. They placed a pile of apples and melons in the center of the mud puddle. The idea was simple. If something wants the fruit, it has to step in the mud. On the morning of September 22nd, the researchers returned to the site. The fruit was gone, but there were no bear tracks. There were no elk tracks. Instead, there was an impression in the mud that looked like a massive animal had laid down to reach the fruit without stepping fully into the center. They didn't just photograph it. They poured 200 pounds of dental plaster into the mud. When they lifted the block out, they had a partial body cast of a massive living creature. The Skookum cast was analyzed by a team of scientists, including Dr. Jeff Meldrum of Idaho State University and Dr. Darius Swindler, a primatologist. They mapped the anatomy. They found the impression of a massive left heel, a thigh, a buttock, and a forearm. The anatomy told a story. The creature had sat down on the edge of the puddle, digging its left heel into the mud for leverage. It had leaned forward on its right forearm to reach the apples. The distance between the heel and the gluteal impression indicated a leg length that was 40% longer than a 6-foot human. Skeptics tried to claim it was an elk kneeling down. But elk legs do not bend that way. Elk do not have buttocks, they have haunches. The impression showed a distinct, rounded, gluteal muscular feature, unique to bipedal primates. Furthermore, embedded in the plaster were hairs. The cast remains in a secure facility today. It is a 3.5 by 5-foot slab of evidence that a primate, weighing roughly 600 to 800 pounds, sat in the mud of Washington state. It is the closest we have ever come to capturing the creature itself. This physical evidence changes the conversation. We are not talking about ghosts. We are talking about an animal that leaves footprints, has fingerprints, and possesses mass. And if it has mass, it has a voice. Washington is unique, not just for what is seen or found, but for what is heard. The acoustic landscape of the Snohomish and Pierce counties has produced audio recordings that are more terrifying than any movie soundtrack. This leads us to the realm of bioacoustics and the infamous "some would I chatter if the footprints prove the mass of the creature, the audio recordings prove its power." Washington state has produced some of the most disturbing bioacoustic data in the world. In the dense, fog-laden valleys of Pierce and Snohomish counties, the silence is often broken not by a howl, but by a siren. We must understand the physics of sound in a dense forest. Trees, moss, and rain absorb sound waves. To be heard over long distances in the Pacific Northwest rainforest, an animal needs to project with immense force. A coyote yip travels a mile. A wolf howl travels 3. But the sounds recorded in Washington's, specifically the famous Puyallup scream, recorded in the 1970s, are registered at volumes that suggest a lung capacity far exceeding any known North American mammal. The sound is not a bark. It is not a roar. It is a long, ascending, metallic shriek that starts low and rises to a pitch that grates against the human nervous system. Witnesses often compare it to an air raid siren or a woman screaming in a tunnel. Bioacousticians who have analyzed these waveforms note a distinct lack of breath pauses. A human screaming at top volume runs out of air in seconds. The Washington recordings show sustained vocalizations lasting upwards of 30 seconds, without a break for inhalation. This implies a chest cavity of massive circumference, capable of holding gallons of air, and a larynx structure that is larger and more robust than a human's. But it isn't just the volume, it is the complexity. In the Snohomish River Valley, residents have reported hearing what is known as samurai chatter, unlike the screams, which are territorial displays. The chatter sounds like language. It is a rapid-fire, guttural exchange of phonemes. It sounds aggressive, articulate, and completely alien. This suggests that the Washington Sasquatch is not a solitary animal wandering aimlessly. It suggests they are communicating, they are coordinating, and in the 21st century, they are coordinating their movement around us. This brings us to the most modern and visible aspect of the phenomenon, the urban interface. Washington is a state of contrasts. It has deep wilderness, but it also has a massive, booming technology sector. Seattle, Bellevue, and Tacoma are expanding rapidly. The suburbs are pushing higher into the foothills of the Cascades. We are paving over the ancient migration routes. Ecologically, this creates a pressure cooker. The creatures are not disappearing. They are being squeezed. This explains the explosion of reports along the I-90 corridor, the massive interstate highway that cuts the Cascades in half. The road crossing encounter is now the most common type of sighting in Washington. These reports are remarkably consistent, whether they come from truck drivers, police officers, or tech workers commuting home late at night. The scenario is always the same. A driver is moving at 60 or 70 miles per hour. The headlights cut a cone of light into the dark. Suddenly, a figure steps out of the tree line. To a human, crossing a 4-lane highway is a journey. It takes time. You run. You check for cars. But witnesses describe the Sasquatch crossing the road in 3 strides. 1 step to the median. 1 step to the far lane. 1 step into the dark. The speed is difficult for the brain to process. It is fluid. It is blurred. But the detail that haunts drivers is the height. When a figure crosses in front of a semi-truck, and its head is level with the top of the cab, you are dealing with biology that is 7 to 8 feet tall. Why aren't there more collisions? Why don't we find bodies on the side of the road? The answer lies in their intelligence. Deer are hit because they panic. They freeze in the headlights. A predator does not panic. A predator calculates. Reports often describe the creature waiting on the shoulder, watching the traffic flow, and timing its crossing with mathematical precision. They understand the machines. They understand the speed. However, there are close calls. There are reports of trucks hitting something that felt like a brick wall, destroying the grille of the vehicle. When the driver gets out, there is no body, just a wet smear of blood, a dented bumper, and a trail leading into the woods that no sane person would follow at night. This proximity to civilization has changed the nature of the mystery. We are no longer talking about a creature that lives out there in the remote peaks. We are talking about a creature that is living in the greenbelts between our subdivisions. They are watching us take out our trash. They are watching our dogs in the backyard. In the suburbs of King County, there is a recurring phenomenon of gifting. Homeowners finding strange arrangements of rocks or sticks on their porches. Pet food disappearing from secure containers without the lid being removed, something a raccoon cannot do. The Washington Sasquatch has adapted. It has become a shadow in the corner of the modern world. It utilizes the noise of the highway to mask its movement. It utilizes the power lines to travel. And it utilizes our own disbelief as camouflage. Because who would believe that a monster lives behind a Microsoft campus? As we approach the final analysis, we must look at the spiritual and cultural impact of this presence. The indigenous people warned us. The scientists analyzed the prints. The drivers saw them on the road. But what does it mean for us? What does it mean to share our territory with a species that we cannot control? Evidence is usually fleeting. A footprint washes away in the rain. A sound fades into the wind. A photo is blurry. But in 2016, a discovery was made on the Olympic Peninsula that offered something rare in this field: permanence. The Olympic Project, a dedicated research group led by Derek Randalls, was called to a remote ridge by a timber cruiser who had stumbled upon something he couldn't explain. He hadn't found a creature. He had found their home. Deep in the huckleberry thickets, miles from the nearest trail, were a series of ground nests. These were not the simple depressions left by bears or elk. These were architectural constructs. The nests were oval-shaped, measuring anywhere from 4 to 8 feet in diameter. But the defining feature was the construction method. The huckleberry bushes had not been crushed. They had been woven. Branches were snapped, twisted, and interlaced to create a springy, elevated mattress that kept the occupant off the wet mud. Bear biologists who examined the site confirmed that bears do not weave, bears dig. They create daybeds by scraping the earth. Primates, however, build nests. Gorillas and chimpanzees build elaborate sleeping platforms every night. The structures found on the Olympic Peninsula were mechanically identical to the nests built by great apes in Africa, but constructed with North American flora. The researchers carefully catalogued the site. They found no hair samples viable for DNA, likely due to the acidic soil and heavy rain degradation. But the structural evidence remained. It suggested a group, a troop. It suggested that these creatures are not solitary wanderers, but social animals that sleep together, protect each other, and possess the fine motor skills to manipulate their environment. This discovery brings us back to the central question: why Washington? The answer is a convergence of factors that exists nowhere else in the Western Hemisphere. We have the biomass, a calorie-dense temperate rainforest that produces enough energy to feed a population of giants. We have the topography, a volcanic, glaciated landscape that creates physical barriers humans cannot easily cross. We have the hydrology, a constant supply of fresh water and salmon. But perhaps the most important factor is the time. The forests of Washington are ancient. They are resilient. Despite the logging, despite the highways, despite the sprawling suburbs of Seattle, the core of the state remains wild. There are valleys in the North Cascades that are as rugged today as they were 10,000 years ago. The Sasquatch is not a magical being. It is a biological organism that has won the evolutionary lottery. It found the one place on the continent where the weather is miserable enough to keep humans out, but the food is plentiful enough to keep a giant alive. The indigenous people of the Salish Sea have known this for millennia. To them, Sasquatch is not a monster to be hunted. He is the wild brother. He is the keeper of the forest. He represents the part of the world that refuses to be tamed, mapped, or sold. When we look at the thousands of reports from Washington, the miners in Ape Canyon, the police officers on the highways, the biologists looking at footprints, we are looking at a dataset that is too large to be dismissed as mass hallucination. Science demands proof. It demands a body. And perhaps, one day, the mountain will give one up. But until then, the evidence suggests that we are not alone in these woods. When you stand in the Hoh rainforest, surrounded by moss that hangs like heavy curtains, and the silence presses in on your ears, you feel it. You feel the weight of a presence. You realize that you are walking through a living room that does not belong to you. Washington State is the Sasquatch capital, not because we want it to be, but because the land allows it to be. It is a sanctuary. And as long as the rain falls and the salmon run, the giants will remain, watching us from the tree line, vanishing into the green mist before we can ever truly know them.